As you're coil building, it's very common for there to be some challenges with controlling the curve and the shape of your piece as you're going. So here's some ways that I address that. So I've been building my piece, and you can see that I've gone for this sort of organic loopy shape. And I am needing to think about my exterior surface fairly soon as it's drying. My pieces do start to dry more from the bottom on the way up because, of course, this is the oldest piece. So if I want to have this smooth for, say, really fine drawing or decoration, then I need to start addressing that now. If I'm looking for maybe a more rough texture, then I'm fine. But just don't forget that if you want to change the way that this looks in terms of surface, you can't leave that all the way to the end and assume that it's going to be at the right dampness. I could also take my bag and kind of wrap it up a little bit higher on my piece and really just expose the small amount that I need. But you need to, if that happens, you also do need to every so often unwrap it and take a look at the overall shape of your piece and the profile without the plastic kind of obscuring it, so that you don't unwrap it later and then realize, oh my gosh, I have a completely different shape than I expected myself to have. So I'm going to score just like normal. And coiling does get a little tedious because you are doing a lot of repetitive rolling out coils and scoring, right? But it is something that with practice you do get a lot faster with, so just keep that in mind. So I'm going to score, I'm going to add slip. And I really enjoy working on a banding wheel because, as you can see, it really frees up my hands and gives me a lot more flexibility in what I'm doing and how I'm building when I don't have to also move my clay, or if this was a really large piece, move around it. So from here, I need to make sure that my two pieces are going to join together really well, because even though I've scored and slipped them, they still can pop off, right? So I have two kind of methods that I choose from, partly just depending on preference, right? So one would be with two hands. I would come in and I would support the lower edge, so the lower wall right here, with my thumb and my middle finger. And then I would use my pointer finger to just kind of press down. So my thumb and my middle finger are making sure that I don't change the shape dramatically of the existing wall, and my pointer finger can help press it down. And I like to do this with two hands. And I always like to kind of work towards myself because that keeps my clay from spreading outward. You'll find that that's a really common thing that coil building kind of has a tendency to do, which is to, open up as you're building. And so if you don't take kind of control of that early on, that can really get out of hand pretty quickly. So as I'm joining, making sure that I'm pressing together, that's one way to help make sure that doesn't happen. I also, instead of doing this kind of two-hand joining, I could just use one hand, my outside hand, my fingers are on the outside, and my thumb is on the inside, and I'm kind of combining, making sure that it's compressed and joined together, as well as the initial smoothing and sealing. So my outside hand is really just supporting that outside existing wall, and my thumb on the inside is blending the clay down, which also joins it together. I prefer this one because it actually kind of gets me ahead. So if I'm just doing this first move, which is to compress and seal it together, I then still have to go back and blend it. Now, if I'm going to close this piece off, then I don't really need to worry about smoothing this any further. If I'm going to leave it open, or if it's, say, a functional vessel, then this certainly would need to be smoothed more as I'm going. Now, my piece I've built pretty much all in one go, so it's not super big, but it is starting to get some curves and changes of direction. And at one point pretty soon, I'm going to have to stop and let this dry because it's still fairly plastic and flexible down at the bottom, which means that it's not going to support the weight of additional coils for much longer without starting to kind of change and warp shape. So that's something to pay attention to as well. We do want it to start to dry near the bottom so that you can change and have this interesting shape or just build a really big piece. Coil building is super versatile. It really allows the most options when it comes to building, but it does also mean that you have to be aware of making it structurally sound. So after I've added this coil and I've started to smooth it together, and I really like to smooth both the inside and the outside, even if I'm not going to see the inside, because it makes sure that I have a really strong attachment. And again, if I was building something really large, that becomes more and more critical as there's just more physical weight involved. So I'm kind of stitching it together, you could say, by blending it. And as you'll notice, I started with about a finger thickness of clay, but that has thinned out a lot more as I've blended it together. So that's why I don't want to go with anything smaller than a finger thickness of clay for these kind of general small, medium-sized sculptures or functional objects. So anything that's, I don't know, under 1.5 feet or so. Anything larger than that, I start scaling up my coils proportionally and making them larger so that they can structurally support a large piece. So once I've blended around, I need to go back and adjust. And this is where I keep control of the curve and shape of my piece. So with 2 hands, I'm going to pinch, and you can see already as I pinch in, this clay kind of comes in towards itself. And then I like to use my pointer fingers to just kind of adjust this. So if I want it to curve in, I'm going to pinch it in and kind of curve it in. If I wanted it to curve out, I might just gently curve it out with my thumbs. So this action of pinching and kind of pushing in is how I can make sure that my clay doesn't kind of flower open as I'm building each layer. So I do this each time around. It also helps me, allows me to even it out. So if I have a really thick piece of clay for some reason, then I can kind of pinch it. So I am pinching a little bit, but not dramatically. I'm not looking to really change the thickness of my clay. I'm looking to control the shape as I'm going. And so I'm doing this every time that I add a coil. But as you can see, it is a fairly fast process, right? So that is how I maintain and control the shape of my piece, right? So laying on my coil, making sure I've got it attached really well, blending it together initially, and then coming back in and adjusting my shape all the way around as I go. If you find that it's getting too curving too far out, particularly if it's doing so not just at the top, but maybe from like one end to the other, and you want to change a larger section, you do have the option of cutting out what I would call a dart, which is just a triangle. And you could do this fairly dramatically if you want. So this is a fairly small segment that I cut out, but I could go and cut a larger segment out. And of course, if my piece was super dry down here, I actually can't do that anymore. So that's again why it's important to really take a look every so often at the overall shape of your piece to make sure it's going in the right direction. And so you can see as I've put that together, right, it started open about this wide. As it comes together, it gets a lot smaller and starts to curve in. So I could really change the shape of my piece in a few areas. So if I wanted to change the overall piece and have it curve in a lot more, I might do 3, 5, or more small kind of segments all the way around. And of course, now that I've cut this apart, I need to make sure that I put it back together really well, because I have kind of compromised the structural integrity of my piece here. So I would smooth it together, and then I would grab a small coil and I would add that on the inside. It's a little patch, making sure that I don't just press it open again. So you do have some recourse if your piece really does need a much more dramatic change than a slight shift in or outward, but you don't want to leave that to the end. So always checking as you go, checking your work and editing as you need to. And so that is coil building and manipulating the form to get the desired shape that you want.